Good afternoon. On October 1st, 2013, healthcare.gov launched and promptly broke. Yep. And this was a really complex, high-stakes problem. My company, Truss, was one of the companies that was brought in with a bunch of other engineers to try and help fix it. And as we were going through that process and afterwards, I started to think more about the nature of this complex problem. And I realized over time, I've been involved and drawn to complex problems for a long time. Whether it's developing low and moderate income housing at scale and developing financial instruments for it, for community development finance, to helping to merge a segregated city and county school system in Durham, North Carolina under death threats. And the nature of these complex problems were just interesting, and I started to think about whether there's a framework or a repeated pattern that I could understand. So for the last 18 months, I've been starting to look into it, and I call it infrastructuralism. Now, there's a very long-winded definition of it, but a much simpler way to understand it comes from the efforts of an art innovator. A guy who could not get a gig in late 50s NYC because it was dominated by the abstract expressionists. But, according to Dave Hickey, what this person did was do this: move to the edge and declare it center. Andy Warhol moved downtown. He found his tribe. He found a new group of people who were looking at the world a lot differently and said, that's the new world that art world we need to live in. The rest is history. In fact, actually, it's a factory. So, using these four concepts, we're going to go through a couple stories and see how this works. But let me explain really briefly each of the quadrants. Declare. Declare is your vision. What is the road? Where do you want to get to? Even if you don't know how to get there, but what's your vision? 2 is edge. Moving to the boundary of your own understanding, moving to the boundary and overlapping with other people's understanding and being able to create new solutions, getting out of your own mental model, because with complex problems, you don't necessarily know what to expect. And by the way, as a note, you might find out information in your learning that then affects what your vision is. Move. Move is about taking that information and moving it into the organization itself and being able to have the organization adapt to this new information. There are lots of initiatives, elections, that have failed because they did not move information from the edge into the center in a timely way. And finally, center. Center is about once you get that signal, once you want to double down, you need to press that button. You need to go for it. And it's about scale and it's about leverage. So a lot of you are founders and builders, and you're dealing with complexity all the time. And this framework may help situate some of the efforts that you have. We actually have heard some stories that are very familiar with it, very familiar to me because of this framework. So I invite you, as I talk about some of these concepts, to think about whether these are things that you use in your own organizations or that are challenged by the things you use in your organizations. But first, I will illustrate with 3 stories. Let's go back to New York. Long live the World Trade, long live the king, yo. I'm from the Empire State. All right, so now if you haven't woken up, you have now. New York, the world's greatest city post-war, 1955, straight flexing. And the major flexer was Robert Moses, the city planner who had a strong vision of what he thought a city can be. And he created the Triborough Bridge. He was behind the World's Fair. He was also behind the brutalist architecture that we now know as the projects, and what wiped out lots of brown and black communities along the way. As you could probably guess, he didn't really care that much about what residents thought. He had a vision, he was going straight for it, and it was all about executing that vision. His capstone was going to be the Lower Manhattan Highway that was going to go right through Greenwich Village, destroy Washington Square, and lots of Little Italy, while building a bridge to Brooklyn and eventually Levittown. Now, there's somebody who actually didn't agree with it, who had a very different vision: a resident, a mother, a writer. Enter Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs asked a very different question. What kind of problem are cities? She changed the nature of what was being asked. And in page 2 in Death and Life of Great American Cities, she says, cities are problems of organized complexity. Now, I'd been thinking about this problem for about 18 months, and I nearly jumped out of my seat because it's on page 2. This is somebody who's writing about this 60 years ago. Now, that's all talk, that's all writing, but it's got to go into action, so let's tell that story. She started with the vision. But then, how was she going to stop a bridge just with a bunch of words? What she did was go to the edge. She went to her neighbors. She went to other neighborhoods. She talked to people who were different but had a shared vision of what their life could actually be. And in gathering all this information, she did surveys. She walked the block. She talked to a lot of people. For those of you who are in lean startup land, this is your customer development, right? By gathering all this information, she was able to form a coalition of very diverse parties, but with a common interest. But that's not good enough. She has to move this information someplace where the decision makers are at. And what she discovered was there's these public hearings. Now, those of you involved in politics, public hearings are probably pretty well understood. However, back then with Robert Moses, he was pretty famous for not advertising or not announcing these things until the last minute. But because she had developed coalitions and allies, she was able to find when these were being done and was able to bring this information and increase the number of allies that she had for herself. That was critical. The next step was learning about the key to stopping this bridge. And it turned out it was about making sure there were no condemned buildings. As long as they could keep buildings from being condemned, then the city could not just raise whatever they wanted to do. So for the next 10 years, all of her tactics, all of her organizing was focused on making sure nothing got condemned. And for 10 years, fighting with Robert Moses, she eventually prevailed. What's interesting about it, for me anyway, is that this is kind of a resilient model because neither Moses nor Jacobs could have anticipated things like millennials not buying cars, people moving back into cities, Lyft. None of these things were actually plausible, but because her vision of a city was that of resilience and adaptability, this model can carry through and in some ways be much more influential about city development than Robert Moses was. So, it focuses on learning on the edge. In fact, she says, in short, I should be writing about how cities work in real life because this is the only way to learn. We've heard a lot of those themes already today. So she was the OG infrastructuralist in my mind. Now, I've been talking a lot about problems. I'm talking about complex problems, and a little definition is probably helpful. So Samuel Arbesman, who's a complexity scientist, declares it as complex is a large number of moving parts interacting in multifaceted ways. Think biological cells, think cities, think massive computer networks. And sometimes, because they're interacting in multifaceted ways, you can't necessarily predict what those interactions are going to be. Now, this is contrasted to complicated problems, like building an airplane. Millions of parts, but you kind of know how they're going to interact with each other. And you can probably, if you intend to build a plane, if you have sufficient capital, you can probably wind up with a plane. So the systems there are tightly coupled. Operations and leadership are focused on execution and building toward known standards. Critically important for building a plane. Not so effective if you're thinking about climate change because of so many massive parts and moving pieces and multiple stakeholders. I'm going to make the argument that we are living in an era of increasing complexity, where software eating the world brings different fields into conflict with each other or adjoining with each other in ways that we did not expect. Think about algorithms, and then you have to think about bias in algorithms because they're designed by human beings. Those are things we never really would have anticipated. I'd also say that these problems are some of our most urgent. So making sure that our systems for managing and creating these innovations and then getting them into the public sphere is matched with the problem at hand. And unfortunately, in governance, in international development, there are lots of situations where that mismatch happens. I talked about healthcare.gov, and that's such a story. $200 million was spent on something that didn't work on day one. How did that happen? It was based on a lot of the contractual agreements. There were people who executed correctly what they were asked to do. But the nature of the contracting process prevented it from actually being built correctly. So the good thing was they brought in a new set of engineers, a new set of people with different perspectives, and they came in and they had a very clear mandate. If they didn't hit that goal by December 24th, Congress had the ability to take that and rescind healthcare.gov before, just do it. And so they had a really clear vision, so they had to figure out what problem do we have. They didn't go to the boardroom, they didn't go to the exec room. Where they went was, where are the people who understood the problem? They went to the engineers, they went to the people who were on the front lines, and they had to figure out, well, this whole thing is on fire, what do I put out first? So they started to do things like build problem hierarchies. And Mikey Dickerson kind of made this problem hierarchy kind of after Maslow's hierarchy. And his definition of progress was interesting. He said, if we're working on a higher level of problems than we did last week, then we're making progress. It doesn't presume that that he knows what the answer is, but they know they can make progress if they're working on higher level problems. It's a really clever way of thinking about it. Once they started to work side by side with the engineers who were on the project already, they had to bring that information in to where the decision makers are. And what they discovered there was people couldn't make decisions without going through 3 or 4 or 5 levels of decision-making hierarchy. That clearly was a problem. So they convinced people to do things like agile development. They made sure that the decision-making was really focused and only 1 step away or 2 steps away from the engineers who understood the problem deeply. Now, they had the information from the edge. They had convinced people to move that information inside. Where they then did was create the war room. The war room was the center of where all the action was happening. And it was run by a pit boss. And the pit boss had the ability to spin up or shut down the website at any time for any reason that that person decided to do it. Didn't have to have any approval anywhere else. My co-founder, Mark Follett, was one of those pit bosses. And one day at 1:55 p.m., he got a call from the White House and said, hey, President Obama is going to be in a press conference in 5 minutes at 2 p.m. Is the website working? He was able to answer that question with a lot of confidence because of the way that this team collectively was able to shift focus and move and put the practice of infrastructuralism at the center of their operation. They were successful, but I think the most important legacy is what happened after. So many people came into the public sphere saying, hey, there's a better way to develop software in the public interest. It spawned a lot of companies. My company, Truss, Nava, Nuna, Ad Hoc. It helped bolster US digital services in 18F. And there's a whole lot of people who are looking at this challenge and adopting new methods and thinking about procurement as one of the really important facets of this. So it's an emerging space, and I think it's going to be interesting. Even in the political climate, some of these efforts are still ongoing. Now, I've talked about how Jane Jacobs moved into the edge with residents, and how healthcare.gov moved new engineers into the field. There's a common assumption, there's a common belief in these things. And, well, I won't tell you, I'll let somebody else do it.
Man, I was brave, sailing on graves. Don't think I didn't notice those tombstones disguised as waves. I'm no dummy, here's something funny. You could be an immigrant without risking your lives, or crossing these borders with thrifty supplies. All you gotta do is see the world with new eyes.
Immigrants, we get the job done.
Now, let me tell you, I had to resist really heavily to put not more than one Hamilton reference in. Trust me on this. But a lot of people think that, oh, well, complex problems, we have new software, we have more bots, we have more technology to apply to it. I think the common thread is being able to see with new eyes. This is the importance of diverse teams. This is the importance of conferences like this. But how do you then create an organization that beyond the room, beyond you as a founder or a creator, how do you create an organization that also adopts this? Enter John DeGioia, the chancellor of Georgetown University, which as a Duke person is really hard for me to put this on there. But he had a leadership style that he was given a task, create the 21st century university. And he has a 200-year academic history to contend with and a 2,000-year religious history to contend with. It's a Jesuit school. No one knows what a 21st century university is supposed to look like, but he's got a lot of issues and a lot of challenges in front of him. So he said, okay, we're going to do lots of experiments. We're going to figure out this together. And a lot of those experiments are going to have results that we didn't expect. And when those happen, this was his mantra. Imagine how much energy is released in an organization when you're not shooting the messenger when there's a result that you don't expect or is contrary to the opinion. He is able to create a lot of buy-in, and his job is to make sure that that vision and that declaration of vision is clear. Samuel Arbesman also has a really interesting way of thinking about it, as this is a mindset and a practice that is important for dealing with complexity. Humility without reverence, curiosity without fear. He did not revere a 2,000-year-old Jesuit tradition, but he was able to declare a vision anyway. And he was not scared of finding new answers. He was just curious. How can we build a 21st century university? It's a very different mindset. Now, those are 3 stories. Let me summarize and add one little piece. So, first, declare like DeGioia. Set a vision, and with humility and curiosity. Move to the edge like Jane Jacobs. Go to your neighbors, go to your departments. We heard a story earlier today. Coco talked about her walking around to different departments and bringing in new pieces of information to solve a problem that they said was going to be 5 years. That's exactly this. This is fantastic. So thank you for letting me steal that. And the diversity is not just about demography. It's about the attitude, the language, the mental models, the styles, all the things that come with new perspectives. And this can be in your teams, departments, your customers, your partners, or your competitors. Move. Move is the critical element in getting this information into the organization. Now, I have a story about Truss that I'll add here. One of the things that we do is a thing called retrospectives. Does anybody know what retrospectives or practice it? Okay. Very, very simply, and I'll add resources afterwards to talk about, because it's a great process. We learned it from UK government, and Etsy also has a great process for this. Essentially, every month or at the end of a project on a regular basis, you do 20 minutes of things that were good. Write them on yellow stickies, discuss. 30 minutes of things that were bad, discuss. Action steps, move on. What makes this so powerful? Well, it makes it such that anybody can participate. Now, we had a retro, and one of the junior engineers, woman, said, we have 50% women engineers, but we often call mixed gender groups you guys. Pretty common, right? And we're like, wow, yeah, that's right. What do we want to do about that? How can we move that information into the organization, and then how can we make that center? So a clever person decided to design a Slack bot. And does anybody who is unfamiliar with Slack? Okay, good. He designed a Slack bot. And the Slack bot, whenever somebody wrote "you guys," it would answer, "Did you mean y'all? Did you mean yuns?" For anybody Pittsburgh out there. Do you mean you people, everybody, whatever? And what was fantastic about it was, came from a junior engineer, and it completely changed the culture of the organization because it was transparent, it was able to be seen by everybody in the organization, and it changed behavior in a lighthearted way. And last I checked, designing a culture is a complex problem. So this was a great example of move for me, and kind of fun. Finally, center. Center for me is that war room, wherever it is that you decide to find a signal and double down. And also, to have the courage to say what's not working and stop it. One of my favorite phrases is "kill your darlings." So when finding an assumption that actually doesn't fit anymore, do you have the courage to kill it? So, infrastructuralism is a framework for solving complex problems. And I think that complexity is accelerating, a large part because of software, and a large part because some of these challenges are persisting. Now, I started with an invitation for you to think about in your organization, are these things that you already do? Do you do pieces of it and not others? And I would really like to know. I'm at the edge of my learning as well. And I'd love to get a dialogue about how this works in your organizations, and in fact, where you can challenge this. Now, I think this is important, but tools and tips are not enough. We need more than that. We need heart. We need ambition. We need courage to be able to say, I don't know, but I'm curious enough to find out anyway. There's a lot of neuroscience, as Crystal just talked about, there's a lot of neuroscience that supports that this is a muscle that can be developed, not only in your own personal practice, but in organizations. In many ways, we can start to try and pursue mastery ourselves or in our organizations. So with this practice, we can all start to address some of the challenges that we are facing. And the future of work, I'd argue, is a complex future that we actually can't figure out. But we have the opportunity, and we have the challenge, and frankly, the responsibility for trying. So, my challenge to you is this. If you want to dent the future, move to your edge. Declare that your center. Thank you very much.